I was not conscripted with ceremony. There were no banners, no speeches, no swelling hymns echoing through a plaza. My fate was decided in a corridor that smelled of damp parchment, boiled starch, and old sweat, an administrative artery buried deep beneath a hive's lower tiers. The lumen strips flickered as if uncertain they wished to continue existing, and I remember thinking that the light itself seemed tired. A clerk sat behind a desk scarred by decades of stamps and blade scratches, his uniform yellowed with age and neglect. He asked my name once, misheard it, and did not bother to correct himself. The quill scratched. Ink bled into damp paper. That was the last time my name mattered. From that moment onward, I was a designation, a unit stamp pressed into my documents so hard it tore the fibers. A ration number assigned without comment. A line added to a ledger already thick with lives reduced to ink. The clerk slid the papers back to me with fingers stained black, as if he were returning a library book rather than a future. Temporary reassignment, he muttered, reciting the phrase as one might recite a prayer long since stripped of meaning. Temporary. That word followed me like a lie too polite to challenge. The transit barracks waited beyond the corridor, a cavernous hall once meant for cargo and now repurposed for flesh. Hundreds of us were herded inside, boots slapping against stone floors slick with condensation. The air was heavy with wet wool and promethium fumes, the scent of uniforms never fully dried and machinery never fully cleaned. Every breath tasted of metal and mildew. I found a place along the wall and sat with my knees pulled tight to my chest, my issued pack clutched like a child's comfort item. Around me, men whispered prayers, curses, or nothing at all. Some stared straight ahead, already practicing the art of not reacting. The floor trembled for the first time an hour later. It was subtle, a shiver more than a shake, but it silenced the room faster than any officer's shout. Dust drifted from the ceiling in lazy spirals. Someone laughed nervously. Somewhere far above us, the artillery was testing its voice. Not firing yet, just clearing its throat. No one explained anything. Explanation was a luxury reserved for those with ranks and officers. Instead, a vox horn crackled to life and barked orders in a tone that suggested the speaker would rather be cataloging ammunition than addressing human beings. We were told to prepare for movement. We were told to keep our papers dry. We were told that the Emperor protects. Each instruction landed with equal weight, which is to say, very little. When night fell, I knew only because the horizon beyond the narrow slit windows changed color. The gray of perpetual overcast deepened into a bruised purple, then into something like blackened iron. And then the sky began to pulse. Dull orange light flared and faded in slow, rhythmic beats, as if the world itself had developed a diseased heart. Each pulse was followed by a distant boom, rolling through the stone like thunder trapped underground. The artillery had begun its work in earnest. They marched us out before I could convince myself this was still a drill. We moved in columns, papers clutched close to our chests, boots sinking into mud churned by thousands before us. The guns loomed ahead, vast shapes half, hidden by camouflage netting and smoke. Their barrels angled skyward like the fingers of accusing gods. Servitors shuffled between them, hauling shells larger than coffins, their augmetics whining softly with each step. The air vibrated constantly now, a low, omnipresent hum that settled into my bones. At the forward emplacement, an officer read out assignments from a slate. Names were not spoken, only numbers. When my designation was called, I stepped forward without thinking, the way one steps forward when their turn arrives in a queue. I was directed beneath the batteries, into the earth itself, where trenches had been dug deep and reinforced just enough to delay collapse. "You'll rest when scheduled," the officer said, already turning away. "Do not wander. Do not ask questions. Do not lose your papers." The first shell fired overhead while I was still finding a place to sit. The sound was indescribable, part raw, part scream, part physical force. The ground jumped. My teeth clacked together hard enough to draw blood. Dirt rained down, peppering my helmet and shoulders. Somewhere nearby, a man retched violently. Another laughed, high and hysterical, until a slap shut him up. I pressed myself against the trench wall and tried to breathe. Sleep did not come that first night. It hovered just out of reach, retreating each time the guns fired. When exhaustion finally dragged my eyelids shut, It was only for moments at a time. Each detonation tore me back to wakefulness, heart racing, hands clawing at the dirt as if I were already buried. I learned quickly that sleep here was not a state, but a series of brief surrenders, seconds stolen between impacts, paid for with panic. As the hours stretched on, the artillery settled into a rhythm. Fire, reload, fire again. The cadence became almost comforting in its predictability, which frightened me more than the chaos ever could. I caught myself counting the seconds between shots, measuring my breathing to fit the intervals. When a longer pause came, my body tensed, waiting for the next blow, certain it would be worse for the delay. By dawn, if dawn can be said to exist under a sky permanently stained by smoke, I no longer thought in terms of days ahead, only of the next order, the next tremor, the next chance to close my eyes without being torn open by sound. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like cold water poured down my spine, that this was not a battle I would fight. It was a condition I would endure. An endurance, I was beginning to learn, was just another word the Imperium used for suffering that had been properly filed. They led me down into the dugout the way you lead a condemned man into a cell, without ceremony, without explanation, and with the quiet certainty that it is not your problem what happens next. The entrance was a jagged mouth in the trench wall, framed by sandbags that had gone soft and sagging with rainwater, their seams split like old wounds. A strip of tarp hung over it, stiff with dried mud and punctured in places by shrapnel. Each time the wind rose, the tarp flapped like a ragged banner and slapped wetly against the bags, as if the dugout were trying to speak and could only manage that dull sound. Inside, the air changed immediately. Above ground the wind carried smoke and promethium, but down here it was close, sore and stale, breath trapped upon breath. It smelled of damp clay, unwashed bodies, cordite seeped into fabric, and something older, a metallic tang like rusting nails left in water. My eyes took time to adjust to the dim lumen bulbs, each one caged in wire and sputtering like it was suffering. The light did not cut the dark so much as stain it. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick as oil. Someone had tried to make the walls less like earth. Splintered planks were hammered into the mud, their surfaces warped and slick. The nails were uneven, driven in by hands that didn't care about straight lines, only speed. Where the planks didn't reach, the mud remained exposed, packed hard and then softened again by moisture, breathing in slow, ugly cycles. Every so often, the wall would weep, a trickle of brown water sliding down like sweat. It made the place feel alive in the worst way. Not alive like a creature you could kill, but alive like rot. Prayers were everywhere, scratched into the planks with bayonets, carved into the mud with bare fingers. Some were neat, as if written by men who still believed in the comfort of letters. Others were jagged, rushed, desperate. Words that looked like they'd been torn out of the writer's throat. Tiendior teach surdus shufo gmiwi. One line had been repeated so many times it became a pattern rather than a sentence, like the man had tried to stitch sanity into the wall. I am steer, shia. They assigned me a spot on a bench that wasn't really a bench at all, just a plank laid across stacked crates. The crates were marked with stenciled numbers, ammunition codes and warning sigils. Some had been opened and re-nailed shut. Others were swollen with damp, their corners softened. The plank bowed under my weight and creaked like a complaint. When I sat, the wood was cold and gritty, dust grinding into the fabric of my trousers. Above us, the guns spoke again. The first impact after I entered the dugout was so close it felt like a hand had slapped the earth. The whole chamber jolted. Dust burst from the ceiling in a sudden, choking cloud. It came down in my hair, down my collar, into my mouth. The grit had a taste, dry clay mixed with burnt powder, and it stuck to my tongue like ash. I coughed, and the man beside me laughed without humor. He didn't look up, he didn't even flinch. He just spit brown saliva into the dirt and adjusted his grip on his lasgun as if this was weather. It didn't stop, it never stopped. Each firing sequence overhead turned the dugout into a drum, the planks and earth vibrating, the air pulsing with pressure. The noise wasn't just loud, it was total. It climbed into my skull and pressed on my thoughts until thinking felt like trying to whisper in a cathedral during a hymn. And then there was the vox, A tinny speaker bolted into the wall crackled constantly, a voice barking through static. It recited schedules with the flat indifference of a machine. Battery 3. Fire interval adjusted. Ammunition expenditure to be logged at shift end. Rest rotation delta 90 seconds per man. Repeat, 90 seconds per man. The words made my stomach twist, not because they were cruel. Cruelty in the Imperium is ordinary, but because they were so calm. As if this was a manufacturing line. As if our bodies were just another consumable resource like shell casings or fuel. A man with a slate moved through the dugout, stepping over legs and gear, muttering at anyone whose paperwork wasn't in order. He wore the armband of a junior scribe and carried himself with the authority of someone who could ruin you with a misplaced mark. Unit stamp, he demanded when he reached me. I fumbled for my papers, hands already shaking from the constant tremor. He snatched them, checked the ink, and thrust them back. Keep them dry, he said, as if that was possible in a place that sweated mud. Loss of documentation is loss of identity. Loss of identity is dereliction. Dereliction is punishment. Then he moved on satisfied, leaving me with the certainty that even my existence depended on paper surviving longer than my bones. The dugout filled with routines. Men came and went on rotation, faces grey and hollow, eyes rimmed red with fatigue. When they returned from the gun line, their uniforms were dusted white with powder, and their ears rang so badly they spoke too loudly without realizing. They would drop onto planks or the bare earth, chew their ration blocks like cattle, and try to sleep in the gaps between impacts. I tried too. I learned quickly that you do not go to sleep here. You collapse. You fall into it like a man falling into a ditch, not because it is safe, but because you cannot stand any longer. I curled around my lasgun and my helmet the way I'd been told, like talismans, like bargaining chips. The helmet's rim dug into my ribs. The lasgun's casing was cold against my cheek. I found myself clinging to the weapon, not because I expected to use it, but because it was the only solid thing that felt mine. Each time I closed my eyes, my body remained alert. My bones kept counting. 2 seconds, 3, 4. The next shot should come now. When it did, the dugout shuddered and dust rained down, and my eyes snapped open again. When it didn't, when a pause stretched too long, my heart hammered, waiting for the deviation, waiting for the enemy's answer, waiting for collapse. The strangest thing was how quickly the mind adapts to hell. After only a handful of hours, I found myself distinguishing between different kinds of thunder. The deep, steady concussion of our own guns. The sharper, wetter crack of shells landing nearby. The distant rumble of something collapsing far down the trench line. Each had its own signature, and my nerves catalogued them automatically, like a clerk sorting forms. In the corner of the dugout, a small shrine had been wedged into the earth. It was nothing more than a metal icon bolted to a plank, surrounded by half-melted candles. Wax dripped down the wall in thick, yellow tears. Someone had placed a strip of parchment beneath it, covered in tiny script. Litany of protection, perhaps, or a list of names. It was hard to tell. The ink had run where moisture touched it. Men would pause there on their way out, touch 2 fingers to the icon, mutter a prayer, and then climb into the noise. When they returned, if they returned, they would touch it again, more out of habit than faith. The shrine did not change. The candles did not burn evenly. The wax simply accumulated, layering grief on grief. I started to realize the dugout did not merely shelter us. It consumed us slowly. Dust filled our lungs until coughing became constant. Moisture soaked our uniforms until we lived in a permanent chill. The sound above shook loose not just dirt but pieces of ourselves, patience, hope, memory. Men began to speak less. Faces became masks. Someone would sob quietly in the dark, muffling it in their sleeve, and no one would comfort them because comfort was an energy none of us could spare. At some point, I can't say when, because time here is measured only in volleys, a shell landed close enough that the dugout's ceiling flexed. The planks groaned. A rain of dirt and splinters fell hard, stinging my skin. For a heartbeat, the chamber held its breath. Then the earth settled back into place, and the vox crackled. Structural integrity acceptable. Continue operations, as if the dugout were a machine being monitored, not a grave that had decided to wait. That was when I began to understand something deeply and bitterly. The Imperium did not build this place for our comfort. It built it to keep us functional a little longer. We were not sheltered. We were stored. When the voice finally called my rest rotation, 90 seconds, I lay down on the dirt, curled into myself, and tried to surrender. The ground was cold and wet. My mouth was full of grit. My ears rang with phantom thunder even when the guns paused. Somewhere above, the artillery continued its endless work, and each impact was a reminder that sleep here was not peace. It was simply the brief moment you stop resisting. By the time they told me it was day 9, the number meant nothing. It arrived through the Vox in the same flat tone as ammunition tallies and ration decrees, spoken as if time itself were a resource being consumed at a predictable rate. Day 9 operational status recorded. The voice said, and somewhere far behind us, a clerk would have stamped the date into a ledger that would never smell the mud or hear the guns. I remember staring at the wall after that announcement, trying to feel something, relief, dread, accomplishment, but all I felt was tired. Time I was learning did not pass here. It accumulated. My days became columns, not hours or moments, but lists of tasks repeated until they blurred together. Haul shells, stack crates, sign for delivery, fire intervals adjusted, log expenditure. The shells were heavy in a way that punished the spine rather than the arms, their weight settling deep into the body and staying there even after you let go. My hands were always black with residue, oil, powder, ink, and no amount of wiping ever made them clean. The smell followed me constantly, even when I tried to sleep. Cordite and metal had become part of my skin. They put a slate in my hands on day 17 and told me I was now responsible for secondary logging. The slate was chipped at the corners, its surface scratched by previous owners who had pressed too hard with the stylus. Write clearly, the overseer said, tapping the slate with a gloved finger. Errors will be corrected. He did not explain how. He did not need to. I had already seen a man slapped bloody for smudged numbers, accused of falsifying records through carelessness bordering on sedition. So I learned to write while the ground shook. I braced the slate against my knee, wedged my boot into the dirt for stability, and tried to keep my hand steady as the guns fired overhead. Each detonation sent a tremor through my arm, turning straight lines into jagged ones. When the overseer saw this, he struck my knuckles with the edge of his baton, not hard enough to break bones, just enough to remind me that accuracy was expected regardless of circumstances. The Emperor rewards discipline, he said, as if reciting from a catechism. My fingers swelled and throbbed, but I kept writing. I learned to pause between shots, to anticipate the rhythm, to sneak my marks into the brief silences. I was no longer measuring time in seconds, but in impacts. The thunder seeped into everything. Even when the guns paused, briefly, rarely, I could still hear them. A low, phantom rumble at the base of my skull, like distant machinery that never quite shuts down. Sometimes I caught myself flinching at nothing, my body reacting to detonations that weren't there. Other times, a real shell would land and I wouldn't react at all, my nerves already exhausted. Both states felt equally wrong. Men began to disappear from the dugout, not dramatically, no final words, just absences. A bench where someone had sat yesterday would be empty. A name would no longer be spoken. When I asked once, quietly, carefully, the scribe glared at me and pointed to his slate. Losses, he said. Just that. Losses, as if men were misplaced tools, as if they might turn up later behind a crate. The wounded were worse. They came back changed or not at all. Some were carried in on stretchers improvised from planks and coats, faces grey, eyes glassy with shock. Others walked in under their own power, bleeding through bandages already stiff with dried blood. A medico would glance at them, check a box, and either wave them toward a corner or send them back out with a stim injector and a blessing. Resignable, the slate would say. Reassignable meant alive enough to keep working. Nothing more. No one asked how we were sleeping. No one asked what we were hearing when the guns fell silent. The only questions that mattered were numerical. How many shells fired? How many remaining? How many bodies unaccounted for? The ledger did not have a column for sanity. By day 26, though I only knew the number because it was announced during a particularly long pause in the barrage, I started confessing to the dark. Not aloud. I wasn't that far gone yet. I whispered into my collar, into the dirt, into the small hollow between my hands when I pretended to pray. I confessed things that didn't matter and things that did. Small thefts from my past, moments of cowardice. Thoughts I'd had about running, even though there was nowhere to run to. I wasn't asking for forgiveness. I just needed to hear myself think in complete sentences, to prove that language still belonged to me and not to the Vox. The dugout listened without judgment. It breathed dust and moisture, its walls flexing slightly with each impact, like lungs working through illness. Sometimes a trickle of dirt would fall onto my shoulder while I wrote, and I would brush it away automatically, as if it were an insect. Other times I would let it sit there, grounding me, reminding me where I was. The bureaucracy never slept. Orders arrived at all hours, scribbled onto parchment, and delivered by runners whose eyes were as hollow as ours. Amendments were made. Tallies corrected. Someone somewhere had decided that the rate of fire needed adjustment, and so our lives adjusted with it. When a shell detonated prematurely and killed 2 men on the gun line, the incident was recorded as equipment malfunction. The equipment, of course, would be replaced. The men would not. I remember the first time I realized I could no longer picture my home. I tried, during one of the rare longer pauses, to summon the image of the block corridor where I'd grown up, the peeling paint, the flickering lights, the sound of distant machinery. The image came to me fragmented, like a damaged picked feed. Details were missing. Faces blurred. The memory slipped away no matter how hard I chased it. In its place came the dugout wall, the prayers carved into mud, the endless columns of numbers. I felt a surge of panic then, sharp and sudden. If I forgot where I came from, what was left of me, the answer, whispered by the guns, was function. On day 30 again announced, not felt, I made an error, a single digit written wrong in haste. The overseer noticed immediately. He dragged me into the open trench, the sky above us pulsing with artillery fire, and made me correct the slate while standing upright, exposed. Each shell overhead made me flinch, my hand shaking as I tried to rewrite the number. When I finally finished, he nodded once and sent me back below. The punishment was not the danger. It was the lesson. Accuracy mattered more than survival instincts. Fear was inefficiency. That night I did not confess. I simply stared at the dirt wall and listened to the guns, letting the sound wash over me until thought thinned and stretched. I began to understand that the Imperium did not need us to believe in it. Belief was optional. Compliance was not. As long as the columns were filled, as long as the numbers added up, the system would continue grinding forward, fueled by shells, ink, and flesh. By the time the Vox announced day 40 was approaching, I felt nothing at all. The number slid into my mind and settled there, just another entry in an endless ledger. If there was an end to this, it would not come with a ceremony. It would come with a final notation, stamped and filed, while the guns kept firing. I do not know which day it truly was when the sky answered back. The Vox announced a number 20, something clipped and bureaucratic, but the sound of it was swallowed immediately by a noise I had never heard before. It was not the distant thunder we had grown accustomed to, not the familiar outward roar of our own guns. This sound came from above and ahead and everywhere at once, a wet, tearing concussion that felt closer, heavier, more intentional. The enemy barrage did not announce itself politely. It arrived like a fist. The first impact slammed into the trench line hard enough to knock men off their feet. In the dugout, the walls shuddered violently, the planks bowing inward with a tortured creak. Lumen bulbs flickered, dimmed, then flared too bright, casting wild shadows that leapt and twisted across the walls. Dirt cascaded from the ceiling in choking sheets, filling the air with a suffocating brown fog. I tasted clay and blood at the same time, my teeth having cut into my lip when my jaw snapped shut. Someone screamed. It was a short sound, cut off abruptly, like a line severed with a blade. There was no echo, no fading away. One moment there was a voice, the next there was not. I did not look toward the sound. None of us did. We had learned by then that looking did not help. The counter-barrage intensified. Impacts overlapped, detonations stacking on top of one another until the ground no longer had time to settle between blows. The dugout became a living thing in distress, groaning and flexing, dust pouring down its walls like sweat. A plank split with a sharp crack, spraying splinters across the chamber. One lodged in a man's cheek. He didn't even cry out, just reached up and pulled it free with a dull grunt, his eyes unfocused. The vox erupted into frantic chatter, overlapping voices barking corrections, coordinates, accusations. Orders were repeated, contradicted, repeated again. Through the static, one phrase cut through clearly: preserve records, not preserve lives, not secure wounded. Preserve records. An overseer shoved his way through the dugout, his coat streaked with mud and wax, his eyes wide but hard. He grabbed my shoulder with a grip that hurt and pointed toward the storage alcove where the ledgers were kept, stacked in sealed crates. If the ceiling goes, he shouted, leaning close so I could hear him over the bombardment, you get those out first. Understand? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He released me and moved on, already shouting at someone else. Another shell landed close enough that the dugout ceiling sagged visibly, earth bulging downward like a bruise forming in slow motion. For a heartbeat, I was certain it would collapse. I imagined the weight of the world coming down, imagined being crushed flat and silent, another loss to be logged later. The thought was almost comforting in its simplicity, but the ceiling held. Barely. Smoke began to seep in from somewhere, grey, acrid, stinging the eyes and throat. It mixed with the dust, turning the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe it. Men coughed violently. One retched, then laughed weakly, as if surprised to still be alive. The shrine candles were knocked over by a shockwave, their flames guttering out, wax spilling across the dirt. The icon hung crooked now, askew on its bolts, watching us with the same blank indifference as always. Another impact, this one closer still. The sound was not just heard but felt, a pressure that slammed into my chest and rattled my teeth. My ears rang sharply, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else for a moment. In that brief, terrible silence, I became aware of something else: the smell, not just cordite and dust, but burned flesh, sweet and nauseating, creeping into the dugout like a confession. The order came to move wounded. Not to safety, there was no safety, but to clear access routes. I crawled along the floor, my hands sinking into soft mud mixed with spilled blood, my knees scraping against buried debris. Bodies were everywhere, some moving, some not. A man lay on his side, clutching his abdomen, fingers slick and red, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I did not stop. I could not. Another man had lost his leg below the knee, the stump wrapped hastily in a blood-soaked cloth. He stared at me as I passed, his eyes wide and pleading. I looked away. Outside the dugout, the world was unrecognizable. The trench line was a ruin of collapsed walls and smoking craters. The sky above churned with smoke and fire, lit in violent flashes that turned everything into stark black and white stills. The artillery crews were still at their posts, moving with grim, mechanical precision, loading and firing as if nothing had changed. Their faces were masks of ash and exhaustion, eyes rimmed red, jaws clenched tight. Shells screamed overhead, some ours, some not, crossing paths in the air like intersecting lines of fate. I dragged a crate of ledgers toward a more stable section of trench, my arms screaming with effort. Each step was a gamble. The ground shifted unpredictably beneath my boots, mud sucking at my soles like it wanted to claim me. Around me, men shouted warnings, prayers, curses. A shell landed close enough to knock me flat, the crate flying from my grip and spilling its contents into the mud. Pages scattered, white against brown, ink running as moisture soaked into them. I scrambled to gather them, my fingers clumsy and numb, my heart hammering in my ears. When I finally made it back into a reinforced section of trench, I collapsed against the wall, clutching the ledgers to my chest like a shield. My whole body shook uncontrollably, adrenaline and terror finally catching up to me. Someone stepped over me without comment. Another man leaned against the opposite wall and slid down slowly, leaving a dark smear behind him. He closed his eyes and did not open them again. That night, if it can be called night under a sky permanently aflame, I did not sleep so much as lose consciousness in fragments. Each time my eyes closed, I jerked awake at the next impact, convinced the ceiling was giving way. My mouth was full of grit. My head rang constantly. Every shadow looked like a collapse waiting to happen. I kept expecting to hear another scream cut short, and each time the guns fired, I flinched. certain this would be the one that finished us. When the barrage finally lessened toward something like its previous rhythm, the damage was assessed with cold efficiency. Sections of trench were declared non-functional. Numbers were adjusted. Losses were tallied. No one spoke about the fear, the screams, the moment when the earth itself seemed to turn against us. Those things were not useful. They did not belong in the ledger. As I lay there, staring at the dirt inches from my face, I understood something with terrible clarity. The sky had not fallen inward because the enemy was stronger. It had fallen inward because this place, this war, was designed to grind everything down eventually. Flesh, faith, even the ground beneath us. And when it did, the only thing that mattered was whether the paperwork survived long enough to record it. Hunger did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through adjustments and annotations, announced politely through the Vox as a matter of efficiency. Ration allocation revised, the voice said, as if it were discussing fuel lines or ammunition belts. Consumption exceeding projections. There was no anger in the words, no threat, just a correction. And with that correction the H began. Our rations had never been generous. Blocks of compressed corpse, starch wrapped in waxed paper, tasting faintly of chemicals and something vaguely meaty, if you tried not to think too hard about it. Before, they had been sufficient, just enough to keep hands steady and legs moving. Now they were smaller, thinner, issued less often. I noticed it first in the way my hands shook even when the guns were silent, in the hollow tightness under my ribs that never quite went away. The commissary was a table set up under a canvas awning, guarded by 2 armed men who looked more alert than anyone else on the line. Hunger sharpened obedience. They knew it, and they wore that knowledge like armor. A scribe sat behind the table, with a ledger thicker than my forearm, his fingers flipping pages with reverent care. Each man stepped forward, presented his papers, received his portion, and moved on. No words exchanged unless there was a discrepancy. Discrepancies were dangerous. When my turn came, the scribe frowned at his slate and then at me. "Reduced allotment," he said, sliding the smaller ration across the table. I stared at it for a heartbeat too long. One of the guards shifted his grip on his rifle, the movement subtle but unmistakable. I took the ration and stepped aside, my mouth already watering despite myself. We were told the reduction was temporary. Everything was temporary. The word had lost all meaning. The hunger made everything sharper and duller at the same time. Sounds grated more harshly. Smells, oil, blood, smoke, became overwhelming. At the same time, my thoughts slowed, becoming thick and sticky, as if wading through mud. I caught myself staring at the ration block before eating it, turning it over in my hands, weighing whether to eat it all at once or try to make it last. Either choice felt wrong. Either choice ended the same way. The overseers noticed. Of course they did. Hunger made us sloppy. Men dropped shells. Numbers were miswritten. Tempers flared over nothing. Each infraction was met with correction, and each correction was justified as necessary discipline. Efficiency under strain. The officers called it. The emperor tests his servants. It was during this period that a man stole. He was small, quiet, the kind of person who had survived this long by not drawing attention. I did not see him take the tin of corpse starch from the supply crate. No one admitted to seeing it. But when the shortage was discovered, it was as if the crime itself had summoned witnesses from the dirt. Accusations flew. Voices rose. The commissary halted distribution immediately. The man was dragged forward within the hour. His papers were torn from his hands and checked against the ledger. A discrepancy was found. Of course it was. There always is when someone looks hard enough. He denied it weakly, his voice cracking, eyes darting around the gathered men, as if searching for mercy. There was none to be found. Mercy was not on the ration list. They made us watch. They lined us up in the trench between volleys, timing it carefully. The guns thundered overhead, their roar a constant backdrop, and the officer waited for a moment when the noise peaked. Then he read the charge aloud: theft of imperial resources, endangerment of operational efficiency, moral failure. The words were formal, distant, as if describing a malfunctioning machine rather than a starving man. The execution was quick. A single shot. The sound was swallowed by the artillery, exactly as planned. The man fell without drama, his body slumping into the mud. Some of us flinched anyway, others did not react at all. The officer nodded once, satisfied, and gestured for the next volley to resume. The corpse was dragged aside to keep the trench clear. We were dismissed back to our duties. The commissary reopened. Rations were distributed as if nothing had happened. I was ordered to write the incident report. My hands were slick when I took the slate. I did not know if it was blood or sweat. Probably both. The stylus slipped slightly as I began to write, and I forced myself to slow down, to form each letter carefully. Date, time, offense, resolution. I recorded the execution in precise, neutral language, careful to avoid any phrasing that might imply regret or doubt. When I finished, an officer glanced over my shoulder. "You missed a comma," he said, tapping the slate. I corrected it. He nodded and moved on. That was the moment something inside me finally settled into place, not broke, exactly, but hardened. I understood then that the Imperium did not simply tolerate cruelty, it required it. It refined it into procedure, wrapped it in regulation, and called it virtue. Hunger was not a failure of supply. It was a tool. Fear was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was reinforcement. That night I ate my ration slowly, forcing myself to chew each mouthful until it dissolved into tasteless paste. Around me, men did the same, eyes downcast, jaws working mechanically. No one spoke of the execution. Speaking of it would serve no function. Silence was safer. Sleep came harder than ever. My stomach cramped painfully, a dull, persistent ache that made it impossible to find a comfortable position. When I did drift off, my dreams were full of ledgers and numbers, columns of figures that blurred when I tried to read them. I woke repeatedly to the sound of artillery and the memory of the man's eyes as he realized the guns would drown out his death. In the days that followed, the hunger deepened, more reductions, more discipline. We grew thinner, sharper, edged, more brittle, and through it all, the bureaucracy hummed along, perfectly satisfied with its own efficiency. The enemy did not need to starve us. We were doing it ourselves, properly logged and fully sanctioned. The shelling never truly stopped after that, but it changed its character, the way a sick man's breathing changes when the fever deepens. There were longer pauses now, long enough for hope to begin forming, thin and foolish, and then sharper, more deliberate strikes that arrived like answers to unspoken questions. It felt less like noise and more like intent, as if something out there was listening for stillness and punishing it. These were the hours when the dugout grew dangerous. In the gaps between barrages, the silence pressed down harder than the sound ever had. It was not absence, not peace. It was a pressure in the ears, a vacuum that made every small noise obscene. Boots shifting, someone swallowing, the faint drip of water running down the wall. Each sound felt too loud, too exposed, as if we were betraying our position simply by existing. That was when I began to hear them. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A murmur that could have been the vox bleeding static, a scrape that might have been the earth settling. But the sounds had shape, cadence. They came from the collapsed sections of trench, from sealed tunnels marked unstable, in chalk and prayer. I would be writing at my slate when I heard my name, or something close enough to it, spoken softly, as if by someone standing just out of sight. I never turned my head quickly anymore. Sudden movements felt dangerous, superstitious. I trained myself to keep my eyes down, to pretend I hadn't noticed anything. That was the safest response. Still, the voices persisted. Some whispered prayers, familiar litanies spoken backward, syllables twisted and wrong. Others cried softly, the sound muffled as if trapped behind layers of dirt and timber. Once, I heard laughter, wet and breathless, and felt my stomach twist with revulsion. I told myself it was combat stress. Everyone did. It was the approved explanation, stamped and filed long before any of us arrived. Stress explained shaking hands. Stress explained sleeplessness. Stress explained why men stared at walls and muttered to themselves. As long as it had a name, it could be ignored. The medici agreed when I finally reported it, carefully, indirectly, framing it as auditory irregularities during rest intervals. He did not look up from his tray as he listened. He simply nodded, reached into a crate, and produced a small vial stamped with an expiry date so old the ink had faded. Sedative, he said. Standard issue. Rations adjusted accordingly. He handed it to me like a blessing. The injection burned going in, a sharp sting followed by a spreading warmth that made my limbs feel heavy and distant. The world slowed, the edges of things softened. The guns still fired, but their thunder felt far away, like a storm heard from another room. For the first time in weeks, I slept for more than a minute at a time. That was when the dreams began. They were not the jumbled, half-formed nightmares of exhaustion. They were precise, clear. I dreamed of the collapsed tunnels, intact and lit by flickering candles. Faces waited there, men I recognized and men I did not, their expressions calm, almost welcoming. They spoke without moving their mouths, their words settling directly into my thoughts. They did not accuse. They did not threaten. They simply told me things. Names, numbers, dates that had not yet happened. I woke from these dreams soaked in sweat, my heart pounding, the taste of dirt and wax in my mouth. Sometimes I found myself whispering replies before I realized I was awake. Once, I woke with my fingers digging into the mud wall, nails torn and bleeding, as if I had been trying to claw my way inside. The sedative dulled my fear, but it sharpened everything else. The whispers followed me into wakefulness now, slipping into the pauses between thoughts. When a tunnel collapsed during a minor barrage and buried 3 men alive, I heard their voices that same night, calm and conversational, asking me to remember them properly. I wrote their unit stamps down in the margin of my slate before I could stop myself. Sleep became something to dread, wakefulness was misery, but it was predictable. Sleep was an invitation. Each time my eyes closed, I felt like I was leaning toward a door that was slowly opening from the other side. I began to fight it, forcing myself to stay awake through rest rotations, pinching my skin, chewing grit, anything to keep my mind anchored. The overseers noticed my fatigue and warned me about performance degradation. I nodded and promised improvement. Promises were easy. Fulfillment was optional. Others were worse off than me. One man began praying aloud in the silence, long, rambling confessions that bled into accusations against himself. Another refused to sleep at all, his eyes bloodshot and wild, until he collapsed mid-duty and was dragged away, marked non-functional. I never saw him again. A scribe told me later he had been reassigned to a penal detail. I did not ask where. The dead were accumulating, and not just in the ledger. The dugout felt crowded now, even when it was half empty. Cold spots lingered where men had died. Tools went missing and reappeared in strange places. Once, I found my slate laid neatly beside me when I was certain I had left it across the chamber. I stopped questioning these things. Questioning required energy, and energy was scarce. One night, during a long unnatural lull, the whispers grew louder. Not frantic, not threatening, just insistent. They spoke in unison. A low chorus that vibrated through the earth itself. I pressed my hands over my ears and rocked back and forth, whispering the litany of endurance through clenched teeth. The guns resumed abruptly, shattering the silence, and the voices vanished like smoke. I wept then quietly, not out of fear but out of relief. The artillery had saved me. The noise had driven them back. That was when I understood how far I had fallen, that I now welcomed the guns. Welcomed the thunder and the death they promised, because silence had become worse. By the time the Vox announced new movement orders were being prepared, I was exhausted beyond fear. My dreams and waking hours had begun to blur together, and the whispers felt closer, more familiar. If this was madness, it was an orderly madness, shaped by trenches and timetables and stamped approvals. I suspected dimly that whatever waited for us next would not allow even this fragile balance to survive. The order arrived without warning, which is to say it arrived exactly as all orders do, through the Vox, clean and unemotional, its phrasing honed by centuries of repetition. There was no build-up, no justification offered. Just a sentence, spoken once and then repeated for clarity, as if clarity were the problem. Advance elements to reclaim designated ground. Artillery to maintain pressure. Everyone understood what that meant. We were to move forward while the guns continued to fire. Not cease fire, not even reduce fire. Maintain pressure. The phrase settled into my chest like a stone. I felt the whispers stir faintly at the edges of my thoughts, curious, attentive. They handed out movement orders on thin sheets of parchment, each one bearing unit stamps, rote markings, and time windows measured in seconds. I watched men sign for them with ink-stained fingers, each signature shaky but obedient. No one refused. Refusal was not an option that existed in the Imperium's vocabulary. Even hesitation drew sharp looks from overseers and the quiet click of a safety being disengaged. When my turn came, I signed without reading more than the first line. I already knew the rest. Coordinates meant nothing to me anymore. The ground ahead was all the same. Churned mud, shattered debris, bodies that would not be collected until someone decided they were interfering with operations. I folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into my coat, as if protecting it might somehow protect me. The guns adjusted their angle slightly. I felt it more than I heard it, a subtle shift in the rhythm overhead. The barrage crept forward, but not far enough. Never far enough. The gap we were meant to cross was a corridor of death, a place where shrapnel and debris rained down in unpredictable arcs. The officers assured us the timing was precise. They always did. We climbed out of the trenches when the signal flare went up, its sickly light staining the smoke-choked air. The moment my boots left the relative shelter of the dugout, the world seemed to expand violently around me. Sound crashed in from every direction. The air burned my lungs with each breath, hot and gritty, tasting of scorched earth and chemicals I could not name. My lasgun felt absurdly light in my hands, a child's toy against the scale of destruction. We moved forward in a staggered line, just as trained, spacing ourselves according to doctrine that assumed ideal conditions and compliant physics. Men ahead of me vanished in sudden bursts of red mist and flying fragments, their deaths so abrupt there was no time for screams. Others fell and did not get back up, their bodies twitching as concussive shock rippled through them. The ground was uneven, cratered and treacherous, sucking at my boots, trying to pull me down. The guns roared overhead, closer now, too close. Each shell passed with a tearing scream that made me flinch instinctively, ducking my head even though I knew it was useless. The barrage was supposed to shield us, to suppress the enemy. Instead, it felt like walking beneath a collapsing ceiling, every step a gamble against our own fire. Officers shouted for momentum. Forward! For the Emperor. Their voices were hoarse, strained, but relentless. Momentum. As if we were machines that could be kept running simply by increasing speed. As if stopping was a choice. I tripped over a body and went down hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. Mud splashed up, filling my mouth and nose. I rolled instinctively, coming up on one knee, my heart hammering. The body beneath me was still warm, the helmet crushed inward, face unrecognizable. I did not apologize. Apologies were for the living. I staggered on, my vision narrowing, the world reduced to immediate obstacles and flashes of light. Shrapnel hissed past like angry insects. Something slammed into my shoulder, spinning me sideways. Pain flared white-hot, then dulled quickly, shock numbing it. My arm still moved. That was all that mattered. At some point, I cannot say when, I realized I was alone. The men who had started beside me were gone, either ahead or behind or scattered across the field in pieces. The officers' voices had faded, replaced by the endless thunder of artillery and the wet, close explosions of enemy fire. I moved because stopping felt worse than dying. Each step was an act of defiance against gravity, exhaustion, and terror. The whispers returned then, stronger than before, not frantic, not mocking, encouraging. They told me where to place my feet, when to duck, when to run. I did not question it. I followed their guidance without thinking, my body responding before my mind caught up. If this was madness, it was a useful madness. A shell landed nearby and threw me forward into a crater. I slid down into it, landing hard in soft mud that stank of rotten blood. Broken helmets and fragments of equipment jutted out at odd angles, half buried. A hand protruded from the muck. Fingers curled as if grasping for something just out of reach. I pressed myself flat against the crater wall, chest heaving, and waited for the next impact. It did not come immediately. For a moment, there was only the distant roar of guns and the hiss of falling debris. I realized I was sobbing, silent and violent, my body shaking uncontrollably. Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on my face. I did not wipe them away. There was no dignity left to preserve in that crater. Surrounded by the remnants of those who had gone before me, I understood the final lesson the Imperium had been teaching all along. Faith was not rewarded. Courage was not remembered. Survival was not a virtue. The only thing that mattered was compliance, moving forward when told, signing when ordered, dying when required. To be consumed without complaint was the highest form of service. Eventually, the barrage shifted again, creeping further ahead. The signal to move followed shortly after. I dragged myself out of the crater, my limbs heavy, my mind strangely calm. I did not expect to live much longer. That expectation had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow acceptance. I walked forward into the smoke and fire, another shape among many, another entry waiting to be written. If I survived this, it would not be because of skill or bravery. It would be because death had been busy elsewhere, and if I did not, the paperwork would still be completed. I survived the advance in the most meaningless way possible, by being overlooked. There was no moment of triumph, no sudden reversal of fate. The guns did not fall silent in recognition of my endurance. I simply found myself standing where the ground was marginally less hostile, breathing air that burned slightly less, surrounded by men who were just as hollowed out as I was. Survival did not feel like victory. It felt like an administrative error that had not yet been corrected. They gathered us in what remained of a rear trench, if it could be called that, an irregular scar in the earth, hastily reinforced, still smoking in places. The barrage continued farther ahead, a distant, ceaseless roar that vibrated through my bones. Medicae moved among us, checking pulses, injecting stimulants, marking foreheads with chalk symbols that indicated priority or neglect. When they reached me, one glanced at my shoulder, now stiff and dark with dried blood, and marked me operational. That was the end of the examination. A slate was pressed into my hands shortly afterward. After action report. The scribe said, his voice hoarse but precise. You were assigned logging duties previously. Continue. He did not ask if I was capable. Capability was assumed until proven otherwise, and proving otherwise required collapse or death. I sat on a crate that had once held shells and balanced the slate on my knees. My hands would not stop trembling. Every time I tried to write, the phantom thunder of artillery echoed in my skull, each imagined impact stamping itself into my thoughts. I forced myself to begin anyway. Date, location, unit designation, objective status partially fulfilled, losses pending confirmation, as if the dead might still object. Around me, men stared into space or slept with their eyes open, bodies slumped in postures that mimicked death closely enough to be unsettling. A few whispered prayers, their lips moving soundlessly. Others simply sat, unmoving, their expressions empty. The air smelled cleaner here, if only by degrees, less cordite, more wet ash, but the absence of constant dust made everything feel exposed. Vulnerable, I wrote slowly, carefully, forming each letter as if my life depended on it. In a way it did. Errors drew attention. Attention led to questions. Questions led to reassignment. Reassignment led back to the guns. As I filled in the columns, images intruded unbidden. The crater full of broken helmets. The man executed over a tin of rations. The whispers guiding my feet through shrapnel. I pushed them aside and focused on the slate. The Imperium did not care about images. It cared about numbers. When I finished the report, I handed the slate back to the scribe. He scanned it quickly, nodding once. Acceptable, he said. The word landed with more weight than any praise ever could. Acceptable meant I would continue. They moved us further back after that, into a staging area that had once been a manufacturum courtyard. The machines were dead now, their great skeletal frames twisted and burned, but the walls still stood. We were herded inside and told to wait. Waiting had become my primary skill. In the relative quiet, the ringing in my ears grew louder. Without the constant thunder to mask it, the sound was unbearable, a high, thin whine that made it hard to think. I pressed my palms against my temples and rocked slightly, trying to ground myself. The whispers were quieter here, distant and disappointed like voices muffled by too much stone. Clerks arrived with lists. Names, actual names, not just designations, were read aloud, each followed by an instruction: medical reassignment, penal labor, forward redeployment. When a name was called and no one answered, it was noted without comment and the list continued. The dead did not interrupt procedure. When my designation was read, the instruction was simple: await further orders. I felt a strange flicker of something then, relief perhaps, or its pale imitation. Awaiting orders meant a pause. Pauses were rare. I spent that pause sitting against a cracked wall, staring at a patch of flaking paint that had somehow survived the bombardment. It was a dull yellow once, now peeling away to reveal bare stone beneath. I watched a small fragment loosen and fall, drifting down like ash. The simplicity of it held my attention longer than it should have. I thought about home again, weakly, without expectation. The image did not come. In its place came the dugout wall, the carved prayers, the numbers etched into slate. I realized, with a distant, academic sadness, that this was who I was now, a functionary of survival. A witness whose testimony would never be requested. Eventually, another clerk approached and handed me a new set of papers. Fresh ink, new unit stamps, temporary reassignment. The phrase stared up at me, unchanged, eternal. I signed where indicated, my hand steadier now than it had been days ago. Habit had replaced fear. As they led us toward transport, armored carriers streaked with grime and old blood, I looked back once, toward the distant glow of artillery fire staining the horizon. The guns were still working. They always would be. Somewhere beneath them. Men were counting seconds between impacts, clutching weapons and helmets, learning the same lessons I had learned. I understood then that my confession did not matter. Whether I spoke these words aloud or kept them locked inside my skull, the outcome would be the same. I was already filed away, reduced to entries in ledgers and reports that would outlive me. I would be reassigned. I would endure, or I would die. Either way, the paperwork would be completed. As the transport doors closed and the engine rumbled to life, I felt no fear. Only a vast, exhausted acceptance. The Imperium did not need my hope. It did not need my faith. It needed my compliance, my labor, my eventual absence. And when the time came, whether under artillery, in a trench, or alone in the dark, it would close my case with the same care it gave to all things, stamped, filed, forgotten.